Chapter 1: The Sleeping Town and the Horror Awakened. Let's start our story by setting the stage. Picture Madison, Indiana in the early 1990s, a river town that looks as if it stepped out of a postcard. Locals nicknamed it Mayberry for its sleepy charm and tight-knit community. It's the sort of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors greet each other with a wave, and where gossip travels faster than the Ohio River that runs alongside it. Lush hills, small shops, and steamboat whistles give the town a comforting soundtrack. Even the old courthouse seems to be relaxing, leaning back against the riverbank like a grandparent enjoying the sun. In their minds, bad things happen somewhere else, to other people. Madison was safe. Residents took pride in that reputation. One woman was quoted as saying, "This is Mayberry." She meant it. In her heart, Madison wasn't just a town, it was family. Parents raised kids without much fear. Teenagers hung out on front porches, listening to music and watching the river roll by. The sheriff's office dealt with petty theft, not grisly crimes. Life moved at a gentle pace, and if something exciting happened, it was probably the high school football team making it to sectionals. On a cold January morning in 1992, that peaceful routine shattered. Two hunters were out near an isolated gravel road in Jefferson County, just outside Madison. They expected to find deer prints and maybe a rabbit if they were lucky. Instead, they stumbled upon a sight so shocking it would change their town forever. At first glance, they thought it was a mannequin, perhaps dumped by someone cleaning out a garage. As they moved closer, the awful reality came into focus. This wasn't plastic, it was the charred remains of a human body. They immediately called the authorities, trembling hands and all. Nobody hunts expecting to find a horror scene. Word spread through Madison like wildfire. The sheriff's department arrived, and soon the road was lined with police cars. Officers collected evidence, spoke in hushed voices, and tried to shield curious onlookers from the grim discovery. Throughout the day, rumors buzzed. Who was the victim? How did this happen? This was more than a shock, it was a rupture in the town's sense of safety. It soon became clear that the body belonged to 12-year-old Shanda Sharer, a sixth grader from another small Indiana town who had been reported missing the day before. The idea that teenagers could have done this was unimaginable to most adults. Yet whispers in the halls of Madison Consolidated High School hinted at a story unlike anything the town had seen. Four teenage girls, Melinda Loveless, Hope Rippey, Tony Lawrence, and Mary Laureen Laurie Tackett, were involved in Shanda's abduction and murder. The news rocked the community. People kept shaking their heads, repeating that line about Mayberry as if saying it could make this nightmare go away. It didn't. Before we dive deeper, let's take a breath. This tale is as much about youthful obsession and jealousy as it is about violence. To understand the gravity, we must also understand the characters. The ringleader, Melinda Loveless, was reportedly consumed by jealousy over Shanda's friendship with another girl. Laurie Tackett, the focus of our series, had her own troubled background. Born in 1974 to a factory worker father and a deeply religious Pentecostal mother, Laurie grew up in Madison. She later said she was molested as a child and felt suffocated by her mother's strictness. She began rebelling in her teens, dropping out of high school, getting interested in the occult, and struggling with mental health. These details aren't excuses. Nothing can excuse what happened, but they hint at the chaotic emotions swirling in her life. Laurie's path crossed with Melinda's when she visited Louisville in 1991. The two bonded over music, mischief, and their shared sense of being outsiders. By the time she moved back to Madison, Laurie was still in daily contact with Melinda. Their friendship would soon lead them down a dark road. On January 10, 1992, the night before the body was discovered, Laurie, Melinda, and two other girls set out with a plan that started as a twisted prank but spiraled into something far worse. They coaxed Shanda into a car with the promise of taking her to meet a friend at an old, supposedly haunted stone house locals called the Witch's Castle. What began as teenage jealousy transformed into hours of sadism. We won't dwell here on the details of that night, we'll explore them chapter by chapter in this series. For now, it's enough to know that this group of girls committed an unimaginable act that ended with Shanda's body burning in a field, discovered by two unsuspecting hunters. The immediate aftermath tested Madison's soul. Police, already overwhelmed by the brutality, had to process the idea that the suspects were all underage. Reporters descended upon the town, and cameras captured stunned faces. Parents held their children closer. Teachers scanned classrooms, counting heads, wondering how they had missed the warning signs. Some locals pointed fingers at music, movies, or even the occult as explanations. Others whispered about jealousy and teenage love triangles. Many simply went quiet. Amid the shock, there were small, human moments that showed how the community tried to cope. One teenager told a reporter she felt like she was living in a movie but desperately wished she could change the channel. A retired couple down the road baked a double batch of sugar cookies and gave them to detectives as a thank you. Even in crisis, the Midwest hospitality didn't disappear. Soon, law enforcement pieced together the details. The story that emerged was staggering. The crime had been meticulously planned. Lori Tackett, with her fascination for the occult, had told friends she wanted to scare Shanda. Melinda Lovelace's jealousy had festered. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, perhaps swept up by peer pressure, played their roles. When Tony Lawrence eventually confessed, she described the scene to police in heartbreaking detail. In the days that followed, all 4 girls were arrested and charged as adults. 2 would receive 60-year sentences, 2 would receive shorter terms. For Madison, the arrests offered some closure but left deep wounds. As we close this opening chapter, let's pause to reflect on the bigger picture. Madison's idyllic facade didn't cause the crime, but it did make the shock more profound. The fact that the perpetrators were girls, not grown men in ski masks, forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about adolescent emotions and the potential for cruelty. Jealousy, obsession, and peer pressure can brew beneath the surface in any community, no matter how peaceful it seems. In the coming chapters, we'll explore these themes, learn about the backgrounds of each person involved, and follow the investigation and trial. We'll hear from people who knew Lori as a quiet girl from a strict family and from those who saw hints of darkness. We'll also speak about Shanda Sharer, the young girl whose life was taken far too soon, and remember her not as a headline but as a 12-year-old who loved music, friends, and sleepovers. For now, as the sun sets over the Ohio River in our Mayberry, imagine the water reflecting pink and orange while people shut their blinds a little tighter. Madison would never fully be the same. But by understanding what happened and why, perhaps we can help ensure such horror doesn't awaken again. Chapter 2, Mary Lori Tackett, Shattered Youth. Before we get back to the night everything went wrong, we need to slow down and talk about one person in this story whose life was already cracking long before Shanda Sharer ever crossed her path. Mary Lorraine Tackett, everyone called her Lori, wasn't born a monster. She was born into a small Indiana town that prized order, church attendance, and appearances. And from the outside, Lori's life probably looked fine. From the inside, it was anything but. Lori was born in 1974 in Madison, Indiana, the same river town people proudly called Mayberry. Her father worked long hours at a factory, the kind of job that keeps food on the table but leaves little energy at the end of the day. Her mother was deeply religious, described later in court as a fundamentalist Christian. Faith wasn't just part of the household, it was the household. Rules were strict. Obedience was expected. Questioning was not encouraged. Lori's childhood was sheltered. No wild sleepovers. No open discussions about feelings. No experimenting, no pushing boundaries. In theory, that structure was meant to protect her. In reality, it made her feel trapped. People who knew the family described a tense home life, where love existed but control ruled. Lori later said she felt suffocated, constantly watched, and judged. When kids grow up in homes like that, they don't always break quietly. Sometimes they snap. As Lori entered adolescence, the cracks widened. She struggled in school and eventually dropped out of high school altogether. Teachers and classmates noticed she withdrew, becoming quieter and darker. She began experimenting with self-harm, a sign that whatever pain she was carrying didn't have words. Instead, it had wounds. At the same time, she started drifting toward things her parents feared most. Lori became fascinated with witchcraft and the occult. Not the movie version with flying broomsticks, but books, symbols, rituals, and ideas that gave her a sense of power and identity. She started wearing black clothing almost exclusively. Dark makeup. Heavy eyeliner. To her parents, this wasn't teenage rebellion, it was spiritual danger. Their response wasn't curiosity or conversation. It was fear. Instead of asking why Lori was hurting, her parents sent her for psychiatric treatment. She was hospitalized more than once. Doctors diagnosed her with emotional and behavioral problems. Lori later said those hospital stays made her feel less understood, not more. She felt labeled, controlled, watched even closer than before. The more adults tried to contain her, the more she leaned into the identity they feared. What's important to understand here is that Lori wasn't failing at life. She was trying to build one on her own terms. She eventually became a certified nursing assistant, which shows she was capable of responsibility and care. That detail matters. People often forget it. Lori could hold a job. She could function. She wasn't detached from reality all the time. She was complicated. And complicated people don't fit neatly into good kid or bad kid boxes. But while she worked during the day, her nights were filled with restless energy and emotional intensity. She was desperate for belonging. That's when friendships started to matter more than family, more than rules, more than consequences. And those friendships would pull her straight into the storm. Around this time, Lori connected with Melinda Loveless, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence. All four girls were outsiders in their own ways. They shared music, boredom, and a sense that nobody really understood them. For Lori, Melinda especially became important. Melinda was loud where Lori was quiet, confident where Lori was unsure. And most importantly, Melinda offered acceptance without judgment. Melinda Loveless, though, carried her own emotional baggage. She was obsessed with her former girlfriend, Amanda Heavrin. That relationship had ended badly, and Melinda didn't handle rejection well. When Amanda became friends with Shanda Sharer, jealousy turned into rage. And rage needs fuel. Lori, searching for purpose and validation, became part of that emotional fire. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence rounded out the group. Hope followed Melinda's lead, eager to belong. Toni was quieter, more hesitant, but still present. Together, the four formed a tight circle where anger bounced around unchecked. Complaints turned into jokes. Jokes turned into fantasies. Fantasies turned into plans. For Lori, this group filled a hole her home life never could. They didn't tell her what to wear. They didn't quote scripture at her. They didn't ask her to behave. They listened. They validated her anger. They shared her fascination with darkness. In that environment, violence didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. Jealousy over Amanda Heavrin became the spark. Shanda Sharer, a 12-year-old girl, wasn't the real target at first. She was a symbol. To Melinda, Shanda represented betrayal. To Lori, she represented loyalty. To Melinda, to the group, to the identity Lori had built for herself. And once those emotional lines were drawn, the idea of scaring Shanda didn't feel wrong to them. It felt justified. This is where adults often ask, how could teenagers do this? The answer isn't simple, but it starts here. Emotional pain mixed with isolation, reinforced by peer approval, and fueled by obsession. Lori had spent years feeling powerless. Now she was surrounded by people who made her feel important. Dangerous, even. And for someone who had always felt small, that kind of power can be intoxicating. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. Hospitalizations, self-harm, sudden shifts in identity, intense friendships, fixation on control and punishment. But in a town like Madison, people didn't talk openly about those things. They whispered. They prayed. They hoped it would pass. It didn't. By the time January 1992 arrived, Lori Tackett wasn't just a troubled teenager. She was someone who believed pain could be shared, transferred, and used. She believed loyalty mattered more than morality. And she believed that whatever happened next was already set in motion. In the next chapter, we'll follow that motion into the night itself. The hours leading up to Shanda Sharer getting into that car, trusting the wrong people. The moment when jealousy stopped being a feeling and became an action. And the moment when four girls crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For now, remember this, monsters aren't born in one moment. They are shaped slowly, quietly, in homes that don't know how to listen, and friendships that don't know how to stop. Chapter 3, Seeds of Jealousy, Planning the Scare. By the time we reached the night of January 10, 1992, the crime didn't start with violence. It started with jealousy. The kind that sits quietly at first, pretending it's just irritation, until it grows teeth. At the center of that jealousy was Melinda Loveless. Melinda was angry, furious, really, over her former girlfriend, Amanda Heavrin. Breakups happen every day, especially among teenagers, but Melinda didn't let go easily. When Amanda began spending time with Shanda Sharer, something snapped. To Melinda, Shanda wasn't just a girl hanging out with her ex. She was a threat. A replacement. Proof that she had been left behind. Instead of processing that pain, Melinda turned it outward. She talked. She complained. She replayed every slight in her head until it hardened into resentment. And when resentment finds the right audience, it becomes dangerous. Laurie Tackett was that audience. Laurie listened. She nodded. She validated Melinda's anger. In her mind, loyalty mattered more than logic. If Melinda was hurting, then someone had to pay. The idea wasn't murder. Not yet. It was framed as a scare. A confrontation. A lesson. Something to frighten Shanda enough that she would stay away from Amanda. That word, scare, did a lot of heavy lifting. It made the plan feel smaller. Less permanent. Teenagers use words like that to soften reality. Nobody said, "We're going to ruin a life." They said, "We're just going to scare her." But fear doesn't stay polite once it's unleashed. On the evening of January 10th, Laurie, Melinda, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence got into a car together. The night was cold, the kind that seeps through your jacket and makes everything feel sharper. Their plan depended on one thing, Shanda trusting them enough to get in the car. And she did. They drove to Shanda's father's house and told her someone wanted to talk to her. No yelling. No threats. Just casual words. Shanda was only 12 years old. She had no reason to think she was in danger. Kids that age don't expect betrayal from older teenagers they know. She climbed into the car, likely thinking she'd be home soon. The car pulled away, and with it, the last moment when this could have ended differently. As they drove through southern Indiana, the mood inside the car shifted. At first, it was almost normal. Music played softly. Someone cracked a joke. But underneath that surface calm was tension, tight, quiet, and growing. Shanda sat in the back seat, small, silent, watching faces in the dark. She didn't know it yet, but she had already been isolated. The group was together. She was alone. Their first major stop was Laurie Tackett's home in Madison. The house sat quietly, just another place on a peaceful street in Mayberry. Inside those walls, though, the mask slipped. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a display of power. At some point during the stop, Melinda pulled out a knife. Not to use it, at least not yet, but to show it. To let Shanda know who was in control. Fear entered the room, heavy and undeniable. Shanda was intimidated, confused, and scared. She didn't fully understand what was happening, only that it felt wrong. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence later said they believed the plan was still just to scare Shanda. They claimed they didn't think anyone would get seriously hurt. And that might have been true, at first. But intent doesn't matter as much as momentum. And the momentum was already pulling them forward. When they left Laurie's house, the road seemed longer, darker. The car became a moving cage. Shanda cried. She asked to go home. Those pleas were met with silence, laughter, or irritation. Once fear enters a group dynamic like this, empathy often leaves first. This was the point where each girl faced a choice. They could stop. They could turn around. They could say this had gone too far. None of them did. Instead, the idea of control took over. The girls had power over Shanda's fear, and that power felt intoxicating. What started as jealousy had turned into something else entirely. Something about dominance, humiliation, and obedience. Shanda was no longer a person to them. She was a problem to be handled. The drive continued, each mile carrying them farther from safety and closer to something none of them could undo. Tony Lawrence, later testifying, said she was scared and wanted it to end. But fear can make people freeze. Hope Rippey followed along, unsure how to stop what was happening. Laurie and Melinda, though, pushed forward. This is how violence often begins, not with screams, but with silence. Not with chaos, but with decisions that feel small in the moment and massive afterward. By the time the car rolled away from Madison, the original scare plan no longer mattered. The girls were in motion, and motion has its own gravity. Each stop made the next one easier. Each moment of fear normalized the next. What makes this chapter so disturbing isn't just what happened. It's how ordinary it looked from the outside. 4 girls in a car on a winter night. No alarms. No flashing lights. No adults asking questions. A child trusting people she thought were friends. In hindsight, this was the last chance for intervention. The last exit ramp before the point of no return. But nobody took it. As the car disappeared into the darkness of southern Indiana, jealousy had done its work. It had convinced a group of teenagers that cruelty was justified, that fear was deserved, and that consequences were someone else's problem. In the next chapter, we'll follow that car to the places it stopped next, places that turned intimidation into torture and fear into something far worse. This is where the word scare stops being a lie they tell themselves and becomes a tragedy the world will never forget. For now, remember this: the most dangerous part of jealousy isn't how loud it is. It's how quietly it convinces people they are right. Chapter 4, Torture in the Night. By the time the car reached the place locals called the Witch's Castle, whatever had once been framed as a scare was gone. The name itself sounded like something from a dare or a ghost story, the kind of place teenagers talk about late at night to impress each other. In reality, it was just a remote, abandoned area outside Madison. No magic. No mystery. Just isolation. And isolation was exactly what they wanted. The car stopped, and the cold rushed in. Shanda was taken out, confused and terrified. By now she was crying openly, asking what she had done wrong, asking to go home. At 12 years old, she still believed someone would step in and stop this. She called out for her mother. That sound, small, desperate, human, didn't soften anyone in that group. It hardened them. What happened next was an escalation that didn't come out of nowhere. It came from hours of unchecked anger and control. Shanda was restrained. She was beaten. She was stabbed. These weren't acts of chaos, they were acts of dominance. Lori Tackett, according to later testimony, used a rope to strangle Shanda until she lost consciousness. Not to kill her, they told themselves. Just to silence her. Just to stop the crying. At some point, Shanda stopped responding. The girls believed she might be dead. Instead of panic, there was relief. They placed her in the trunk of the car, closed it, and drove away. The night continued like this was just another errand. They stopped again, back at Lori's house. The same house where earlier intimidation had taken place. Inside, the girls talked. They laughed. They replayed moments from the attack, treating it like a story instead of a crime. At one point, they heard sounds coming from the trunk. Shanda was alive. Instead of stopping, the group mocked her. That moment matters because it shows something important. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was cruelty. This is the part of the story where people often ask, how could they keep going? The answer is uncomfortable. Violence, once normalized, doesn't feel shocking to the people committing it. It feels routine. The girls had crossed so many lines already that stopping would have meant facing what they'd done. It was easier to continue. Later that night, they drove to a field near a gravel road in Jefferson County. The area was dark, empty, quiet. No houses. No witnesses. They opened the trunk and forced Shanda out. She was weak but alive. She tried to stand. She tried to move. This is where Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They poured gasoline on Shanda and set her on fire. When she tried to walk away, still alive, they burned her again. There's no way to make sense of that moment. No explanation that makes it less horrifying. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was intention. Afterward, they left her there. The drive back to Madison was quiet. No screaming. No panic. Just exhaustion. When they arrived at Lori's house, something happened that still haunts people who study this case. They went inside and ate breakfast. They sat at the table. They talked. They acted like normal teenagers starting a new day. That contrast, the most extreme violence followed by the most ordinary routine, is one of the most disturbing elements of this case. It shows how completely detached they had become. Killing wasn't the climax. It was just another event. Something to step over on the way to toast and cereal. For Lori Tackett, this moment is especially revealing. This was her home. Her family's space. And she sat there afterward, calm enough to eat, calm enough to talk. The same girl who once felt trapped by rules now existed beyond them entirely. Meanwhile, Shanda Sharer lay alone in the cold, her life ending in a place she never should have been. A night that began with a lie had ended in something irreversible. When daylight came, the world didn't know yet. Madison woke up like it always did. People went to work. Kids got on buses. Coffee brewed. The Ohio River rolled on. Nobody realized that just miles away, a child had been tortured and killed by people barely older than she was. It would take hunters, chance, and time for the truth to surface. And when it did, it would rip the illusion of Mayberry apart. This chapter is hard to sit with. It should be. It forces us to confront something we don't like to believe, that cruelty doesn't always look wild or loud. Sometimes it looks like teenage girls in a car, making decisions step by step, choosing not to stop. In the next chapter, we'll see what happens when that silence breaks, how the discovery of Shanda's body pulls law enforcement into a case they never expected, and how the girls who thought they could walk away begin to realize that the world is closing in. For now, take a moment. This story isn't easy, and it's not meant to be. But understanding how the night unfolded is the only way to understand what comes next. Chapter 5, Investigation, Confession, and Justice. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when people believe they've buried it. In this case, it surfaced in the worst way imaginable. On the morning of January 11, 1992, two hunters walked into a field near a gravel road in Jefferson County, expecting a quiet start to the day. Instead, they saw something that didn't belong there. At first glance, it looked unreal, like a mannequin discarded by someone cleaning out a storage unit. But as they moved closer, the smell and the shape told a different story. They immediately contacted authorities. Law enforcement arrived quickly, and the scene confirmed everyone's fears. The remains were identified as Shanda Sharer, a 12-year-old girl who had been reported missing just hours earlier. News traveled fast. By midday, Madison, and much of Indiana, was holding its breath. The discovery triggered a statewide investigation. Roadblocks were set up. Interviews began immediately. Police worked through the night, retracing Shanda's last known movements. It didn't take long for attention to turn toward a group of teenage girls who had been seen with her the night before. The pressure cracked quickly. While some of the girls stayed silent, Toni Lawrence couldn't hold it in. Fear overtook bravado. Guilt overtook loyalty. According to later testimony, Toni went to her mother and told her everything. Not part of it. Not a softened version. Everything. Her confession changed everything. Within hours, police arrested Lori Tackett and Melinda Loveless. Soon after, Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence were also taken into custody. The arrests stunned the community. 4 girls, teenagers, were now at the center of one of the most brutal crimes the state had ever seen. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the full scope of what happened became impossible to ignore. What started as jealousy had escalated into hours of torture. What was framed as a scare became murder. And the fact that it involved young girls made it harder for people to process. The case moved quickly into the court system. Prosecutors faced a complex challenge. The crime was horrific, but the defendants were minors. Emotions ran high on all sides. Some demanded the harshest punishment possible. Others struggled with the idea of sentencing teenagers as adults. Eventually, plea deals were reached. Lori Tackett and Melinda Loveless both pleaded guilty to murder, arson, and criminal confinement. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence accepted plea deals as well and testified for the prosecution, detailing what happened that night. In court, the contrast between the girls' appearances and their actions was unsettling. They sat quietly, hair brushed, hands folded, while the courtroom listened to descriptions of unimaginable violence. Family members of Shanda Sharer listened as well, absorbing details no parent should ever have to hear. Sentencing followed. Lori Tackett received a 60-year sentence, with 20 years suspended, for the murder of Shanda Sharer. At the time, it felt like justice, firm, heavy, final. Melinda Loveless received the same sentence. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence received lesser sentences due to their cooperation. For years, the case faded from headlines but not from memory. Shanda Sharer's name became a symbol of lost innocence, of betrayal, of how quickly cruelty can grow when unchecked. In Madison, the nickname Mayberry never quite sounded the same again. Lori Tackett spent more than 26 years in prison. Over time, she aged. The girl in black became a woman with gray creeping into her hair. She participated in programs, followed prison rules, and eventually became eligible for parole. In January 2018, Lori Tackett was released on parole. The news reignited public outrage. Many people felt the sentence should have lasted her entire life. Others believed that parole was part of the justice system and that serving decades behind bars mattered. The debate was fierce and emotional. For Shanda Sherer's family, there was no debate. No release could undo what had been done. No amount of time served could bring their daughter back. This chapter forces us to sit with uncomfortable questions. What does justice look like when the crime is committed by children? Is punishment about retribution, rehabilitation, or protection? Can someone who committed violence at 16 ever truly be separated from that act? There are no easy answers. What we do know is this: the investigation worked because someone spoke up. Fear and guilt cracked the silence. Without Toni Lawrence telling her mother, this story might have taken longer to unfold. The truth might have stayed buried longer. As we close this chapter, remember that justice isn't a single moment. It's a process. An imperfect one. One shaped by laws, emotions, and time. Shanda Sherer's life ended far too soon, but her story forced a reckoning. It forced communities to look inward. It forced conversations about bullying, obsession, and accountability. And it forced a small Indiana town to confront the darkness it never believed could exist within its borders. This concludes our main story, but the echoes continue. In the next episode, we'll reflect on the aftermath, how this case changed laws, conversations, and lives long after the courtroom doors closed. For now, let the silence settle. Justice was delivered, but peace is something else entirely. Chapter 6: Aftermath and Reflection. When the courtrooms emptied and the headlines faded, the hardest part of this story began. Not for the people who committed the crime, but for the people who were left behind. For Shanda Sherer's family, there was no reset button. No after. Just a before and a forever changed. Shanda's parents had to learn how to live in a world where their daughter didn't exist anymore. A world where every birthday passed quietly. Every holiday had an empty chair. Her father never recovered. Friends and family later said he was crushed by grief. He reportedly drank himself to death in 2005, more than a decade after Shanda was murdered. Some wounds don't heal. They just deepen. Losing a child in any way is devastating. Losing one to violence, especially violence that involved cruelty, can hollow a person out. Shanda's mother chose a different path through the pain. She carried her grief forward and turned it into something meant to help others. In 2009, she established the Shanda Sherer Scholarship Fund, designed to support local students and keep her daughter's name tied to hope rather than horror. It was a quiet, powerful act. A reminder that even in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, people can still choose to give. As for Madison, Indiana, the town never fully shook the case. Years later, people still lowered their voices when talking about it. Parents watched their kids a little closer. Teachers looked for warning signs they might have missed before. The nickname Mayberry faded into irony. The town learned that darkness doesn't need a big city to grow. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. The story didn't stay contained within Indiana. Over the years, it spread through books, plays, and television. One of the most well-known accounts was the book Little Lost Angel, later adapted into the television movie Cruel Sacrifice. The case was dramatized in a stage production called Hazelwood Junior High. Popular crime shows like Law & Order, SVU and Cold Case produced episodes inspired by the events. These portrayals did two things at once. They raised awareness, and they sensationalized the crime. On one hand, they introduced the story to people who might never have heard Shanda's name. On the other, they risked turning a real child's suffering into entertainment. That tension exists in all true crime. It's why telling these stories responsibly matters. The danger isn't in remembering. The danger is forgetting the humanity behind the headlines. At its core, this case wasn't just about 4 girls and 1 victim. It was about systems that failed. Adults who didn't know how to intervene. Warning signs that were missed or minimized. Mental health struggles that were treated as problems to contain instead of pain to understand. Peer pressure that went unchecked. Jealousy that turned into obsession. None of these factors excuse what happened, but they explain how it became possible. Lori Tackett's life didn't end with the sentence. She spent decades in prison. Time passed. Laws changed. Evaluations were made. And in January 2018, after serving more than 26 years, she was released on parole. The news reopened wounds for many. For some, it felt like justice unraveling. For others, it was a reminder that the justice system operates on rules, not emotions. Whether someone believes her release was right or wrong, it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: punishment doesn't erase harm. Time served doesn't restore what was taken. The consequences ripple outward, long after sentences end. Shanda Sharer remains 12 years old in memory, frozen in time. While everyone else aged, changed, and moved on, or tried to, she did not get that chance. This case endures because it asks questions we still struggle to answer. How do we recognize dangerous behavior in young people before it becomes irreversible? How do we balance accountability with understanding? How do communities that look peaceful on the surface address the pain underneath? And maybe the hardest question of all, how many moments existed where this could have stopped, if someone had stepped in? As we close this story, there is no neat conclusion. No satisfying resolution. Just reflection. And responsibility. If there's a lesson here, it's not about fear. It's about attention. Paying attention to kids who withdraw. To jealousy that turns obsessive. To friendships that revolve around cruelty. To pain that shows up as rebellion. Shanda Sharer deserved a long life. She deserved safety. She deserved adults who could protect her from the storm she never saw coming. And we owe it to her, and to every child like her, to listen better, intervene earlier, and never assume that quiet towns are immune to dark currents. As the river in Madison keeps flowing, and as time continues to move forward, Shanda's story remains. Not as a spectacle, but as a warning. And as a call to do better. Let the night be quiet now.